Welcome to the Generation Kids Daily Devo podcast, where we move from wonder to worship, looking for God at work in the world around us, ready to ask the tough questions and discover what His Word has to say to us. Today's episode is titled, A Coffee-Flavored Snowball, and it comes from me, Casey Taylor. These past 2 weeks, we've been looking at the first of our fruits of the Spirit, which are the character traits that are grown out of a life lived in the Spirit, where our minds and our hearts are set on the things of God, and how we might live into those character traits. If you've forgotten what the whole passage says, let's refresh.
But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law.
The list here in Galatians 5, verses 22 through 23 is meant to help us understand what to look for, or what we would see in someone who is living by the Spirit. And also, if you go back to that passage in Galatians, before the fruits of the Spirit, there's actually a list that tells you about the fruits of the flesh. The idea is that we'll have some significant signs to help us understand where a person's actions might be rooted, in the flesh or in the Spirit. We've talked so far about love and joy, and this week we're taking a look at our third fruit of the Spirit. Let's jump into today's episode as we look at what it looks like when the Spirit produces the fruit of peace in us. Have you ever seen one of those movies where something small but irreversible happens, and it starts a chain of events that sees someone end up doing something crazy or illegal? All because that one small mistake snowballed and then became uncontrollable, and the once small problem became the undoing of a person's whole life.
This is the end.
These movies illustrate how quickly one bad decision can turn into a pattern of decisions. In fact, most of the time, the people at the beginning of the movie wouldn't even recognize the people they became at the end.
Who are you?
So what happens to those characters in between the opening credits and the closing music? We'll get there. But first, I should tell you, I love coffee. Like, maybe I have a problem because I drink it all day type of love of coffee. So much so that my 3-year-old son used to be able to recite my non-basic coffee order back to me or to the lady at the drive-thru because he'd heard me order it so much. I'm that kind of coffee drinker. My wife and I used to have a rule that I wouldn't leave my coffee anywhere unattended once my oldest son had learned to walk. Because more than once, I'd come back into a room I'd left him in briefly to find him shaking my coffee up and down, splashing all my brown liquidy goodness all over himself and the carpet beneath him. His mother and I agreed that when I'd set it down, I'd do so on some higher shelf or the fireplace mantel when our son was awake, so that we didn't have to deal with the mess if he grabbed it when we weren't looking. When she'd remind me of this, I'd always shoo her worries to the side and assure her that I would obviously be taking the proper precaution around our son with my coffee.
Of course I will.
Well, there was this one time. I left our boy in the living room for about 30 seconds and I walked into the kitchen to grab something. And in that small half of a minute of absence, our son found an opening. He waddled over to the table in the middle of the living room, and like he'd found a treasure long since hidden but now discovered, in a moment of pure victory and triumph, he shook my $6 cup of coffee over his head, much in the same way you'd shake a soda can when you wanted it to explode. And explode it did. All over himself, our table, and our new, almost completely white rug. Now, I walked in right as the explosion occurred, and as I'm watching the waterfall of caffeine descend and claim almost every white spot on that rug, the first thing I thought was, first of all, son, how could you? And second of all, how can I keep my wife from ever knowing that this happened? My gut reaction was defense and to hide my mistake. So what did I do? I changed his clothes and put him in his room, and then I did what any person who is operating in pure hide-your-mistake mode would do. I got the stain remover and used almost an entire spray bottle on it, only for it to take the stain from about a 10 to a 4, clearly no longer as white as it had been. So then I tried the next best thing I could come up with. I took the rug, and I tried my best to shove all 48 square feet of the rug into the washing machine. I was desperate, and I needed to find a solution quick before my wife came home and saw what had happened. Well, to make this story short, not only did the washing machine not clean the rug properly, And since the washing machine was made to wash much thinner clothing and not a living room rug, I broke the washing machine, which I discovered when my wife came home and found the washing machine flashing an error code and opened it to see, you guessed it, our living room rug. Now, what I should have done at the very beginning was probably the first thing I should have done was to put my coffee on the agreed upon spots. But after that, once the coffee spilled, I should have just told my wife and taken ownership of the situation. Because people make mistakes, even the ones they know better than to make. But what happened was that the state of my heart was to preserve myself, to stay out of trouble, more than it was to be honest. I was in a season of life where I'd started a new job, had a new toddler who could move, and I was tired all the time. And on top of that, I made a dumb decision that had consequences I wasn't excited about facing. What was going on inside of me came out in a situation I wasn't prepared for.
The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. Romans 8:6.
In that season of exhaustion, I was operating out of my flesh. And in that situation, I definitely was only concerned about my survival, or trying to find a way not to deal with the consequences of my actions. And it snowballed, and just kept getting worse. This is what a life lived in the flesh looks like. But when we live by the Spirit, Romans tells us that we will have life and peace, which is the opposite of where I was at in my story. When we live by the Spirit, which means our desire is to see God at work within us and to see Him work through us in our relationships with others, our first thoughts when things get tough or when we make mistakes won't be defensiveness. We'll consider how we might make situations right with the people that we've affected. In my case, I tried to hide my mistakes, and I just made more and more. It's amazing how fast one bad decision to cover up one mistake can turn into 4 or 5 mistakes, or even more. But what if our hearts were most concerned about how to honor God in any situation? Well, our passage for today tells us that it looks a lot like life and peace in the believer filled with the Spirit. One of the words the dictionary uses to define peace is tranquility, which is a calm, undisturbed state of being, almost a stillness. When we are operating in the flesh, we are anything but still, undisturbed, or tranquil. We are more frenetic and chaotic inside. But it's important to remember, peace isn't the absence of conflict. When walking in the Spirit, peace is the calm in the chaos, the clarity in confusion, and the stillness in the storm. So whatever you're walking into today, whatever mess you might create, take a breath and remember, the Spirit of God is with you. Let's be people who seek to live by the Spirit, not reactionary or self-preserving, but honest, humble, and at peace, even when life is messy, so we don't end up looking in the mirror at someone we don't recognize, and instead, we see the Spirit at work in and around us.
Now it's time for
Today's Big Question!
Today's big question is, what is a time that your emotions and your flesh took you down a road that could have easily been avoided, perhaps causing you to snowball in your own bad decisions? Look back and think about how a life lived in the Spirit might have caused that situation to turn out differently. Say a prayer, thanking God for forgiving you when you walk in the flesh, and ask Him to build you up in the Spirit, that your reaction to a similar situation will look differently in the future. Thanks for listening to the Generation Kids Daily Devo podcast. If you want to keep in touch with us on all our social media platforms, check out the links in the description. And if you'd like to help support us as we continue to create meaningful content for kids of all generations,